Before the capital wasteland became a shattered landscape of irradiated ruins, roving supermutants, and fractured ideologies battling for dominance, Washington, D.C. stood as one of the most symbolically charged and heavily fortified regions of the pre-war United States, a political, industrial, and strategic nexus whose layered history shaped every event that would unfold in Fallout 3. By the early 21st century, the district had evolved into a dense convergence of federal institutions, advanced military research complexes, and corporate influence, all operating under the shadow of global tension as America's relationship with the international community, particularly China, deteriorated. The Potomac River served not only as a geographic divider, but also as a strategic artery lined with military installations, scientific laboratories, water purification sites, and transportation infrastructure, each bearing significance that would echo long after the bombs fell. To the west, the Pentagon remained the beating heart of the United States Armed Forces. Its labyrinth of command centers and classified laboratories quietly preparing for the possibility of a large-scale nuclear conflict, stockpiling prototype power armor, optimizing command and control systems, and coordinating defensive responses through both conventional and experimental military frameworks. Not far from these military strongholds, the Jefferson Memorial, still a pristine monument in the decades before the Great War, would soon become the cradle for one of humanity's last great scientific hopes. Project Purity, the water cleansing initiative spearheaded by James and Catherine, visionaries who believed that the poisoned Potomac could be restored through a monumental application of pre-war engineering and purified water technology. Their work would earn little attention in the broader pre-war political climate, overshadowed by the intensifying resource crisis that gripped the nation beginning in the mid-21st century. The scarcity of fossil fuels pushed America into a fervent pursuit of nuclear and alternative energy, escalating tensions with China over access to oil fields in Alaska, a conflict that would soon spill over into open war and militarize every aspect of American society. In Washington, the political elite struggled to maintain stability amid protests, security crackdowns, and the ever-looming fear of global escalation, even as scientific and military institutions quietly prepared contingency plans should diplomacy fail. Civilian life in the district remained outwardly functional. Offices, markets, research centers, and urban neighborhoods continued to operate. But beneath that veneer lay a growing sense of unease, especially as the U.S. government began strengthening emergency management infrastructure and dispersing critical federal intelligence archives to secure facilities across the region. Among the most significant of these was the National Archives, which had become a fortified repository of irreplaceable historical documents, staffed by preservationists and security personnel who maintained rigorous protection protocols in anticipation of potential wartime threats. Their work was mirrored by scientists in research hubs such as the Museum of Technology, where private and government-funded engineering teams collaborated on advances in robotics, satellite communications, propulsion systems, and military hardware that would later appear in scattered and often dangerously malfunctioning forms throughout the capital wasteland. Robotics companies like Robco and General Atomics maintained a quiet but potent influence, installing automatons in administrative buildings and domestic environments across the district, embedding the region with a network of machines that, while mundane in their time, would eventually become eerie relics of a civilization frozen at the moment of its destruction. Meanwhile, Virginia's surrounding suburbs and military enclaves housed key logistical sites, such as Fort Bannister, Anderson Air Force Base, and a variety of classified bunkers integrated into the nation's continuity of government plans. These installations developed and stored experimental weapons systems, including energy weapons and advanced power armor prototypes, that would later become highly sought-after artifacts for post-war factions like the Brotherhood of Steel and the Enclave. The district also hosted major Vault Tech initiatives, though not as extensively as other regions. Still, plans for the construction of Vault 87, Vault 92, Vault 101, and Vault 108 were closely coordinated with federal authorities, embedding the corporation deep within the nexus of pre-war national security. Vault 101 inches particular represented a delicate political collaboration, an experiment disguised as a humanitarian shelter designed to remain sealed indefinitely, supported by carefully curated propaganda that assured surrounding communities it would serve as a local refuge in the event of catastrophe. Its construction reflected the broader American pre-war cultural trajectory, one marked by increasing faith in corporate government partnerships, a willingness to sacrifice transparency for perceived safety, and a growing belief that the future of civilization might depend on isolated, carefully controlled communities sealed away from the world's escalating conflicts. Corporate sectors of the region were equally influential. Rivet City, long before its transformation into the largest post-war settlement in the capital wasteland, was still the USS Independence, an aircraft carrier undergoing long-term maintenance and decommissioning cycles that left it docked in the Washington Navy Yard. Its cavernous interior and durable structure would later serve as a sanctuary for scientists, traders, and wasteland refugees, but in the pre-war years it functioned simply as another piece of the nation's sprawling military infrastructure, emblematic of American naval power even in decline. Civilian technology firms operating in D.C. also contributed to the eventual shape of the wasteland, especially as robotics pioneers introduced early model protectrons, Mr. Gutsy units, and security bots throughout the region. These machines were integrated into commercial buildings, government offices, and research centers, often configured with strict security protocols that would persist long after human operators perished in the Great War. At the same time, media networks and communication hubs in the district continued to disseminate government messaging that alternated between reassurance and thinly veiled propaganda, emphasizing national resilience, while downplaying escalating hostilities abroad. This messaging, intended to preserve public confidence, contributed to a cultural landscape marked by both patriotic fervor and willful denial, a duality that would define the final days before the bombs fell. As the Sino-American War intensified, the D.C. metropolitan region transformed into one of the most heavily defended zones in the country. Anti-air batteries, defensive emplacements, and automated targeting systems were installed around federal buildings, monuments, and key infrastructure, all designed to repel or mitigate a potential nuclear strike. The civilian population grew accustomed to emergency drills, rationing directives, and the omnipresence of armed personnel. Families stored supplies, shelter plans became commonplace, and everyday life took on the subtle rhythms of a society preparing, consciously or not, for the unthinkable. The public understood that Washington, D.C. was both the symbolic heart of the nation and one of its most likely targets. Yet, the belief in American technological and military superiority led many to assume that catastrophic devastation could be avoided, or at least minimized. They were wrong. When the Great War finally erupted on the 23rd of October 2077, the district's advanced defenses proved insufficient against the massive nuclear exchange that swept the globe in a matter of hours. The capital region, despite its fortifications, was struck by multiple warheads targeting key political and military sites, incinerating vast urban centers, crippling infrastructure, and wiping out the majority of the population instantaneously. Those who survived the initial blasts faced radioactive firestorms, infrastructural collapse, poisoned water supplies, and the rapid disintegration of social order. Within days, Washington, D.C., a city that had served as the administrative core of one of the world's greatest powers, was transformed into a broken husk of rubble, contaminated rivers, collapsed monuments, and abandoned technologies that would linger untouched for generations. In the chaotic hours following the initial detonations, emergency broadcast systems flickered briefly, with automated evacuation directives and fragmented military transmissions, before succumbing to power failures, leaving the surviving populace scattered across the ruins without guidance, medical infrastructure, or communication. The Potomac River, once central to the city's water management systems and commerce networks, became heavily irradiated as fallout drifted from nearby detonations, poisoning tributaries, and rendering the region dependent on contaminated wells, makeshift filtration devices, or unsustainable water scavenging. The catastrophic contamination would later make Project Purity the single most important scientific undertaking in the region's post-war history. In the decades immediately following the bombs, the remnants of America's military presence attempted to regroup, but most coordinating command centers were obliterated, and surviving personnel either fell victim to radiation, famine, or fragmented into small, unstructured survivor groups, with no means of re-establishing federal authority. Government continuity facilities meant to preserve political leadership fared no better. Many were never activated, others were destroyed, and the political hierarchy of the United States effectively ceased to exist within hours of the nuclear exchange. Without a centralized authority, Washington's shattered landscape devolved rapidly into zones of violent struggle, scavenging, and migration as desperate survivors competed for uncontaminated food caches, medical supplies, and shelter. Institutions that once symbolized the stability of pre-war America, such as the Capitol, the White House, and the Smithsonian Complex, became gutted carcasses inhabited by scavengers, feral ghouls, or early raider factions, stripped of their cultural significance and reduced to tactical high ground or defensible bases amid the ruins. These same structures, having been constructed with reinforced materials to withstand conventional attacks, survived the blasts in skeletal but recognizable form, their durability unintentionally sculpting the future geography of the wasteland. In the centuries that followed, nature reasserted itself over the fractured cityscape. Concrete boulevards split open under the strain of root systems, turning once bustling thoroughfares into jagged, overgrown ravines. Wildlife endured its own horrifying transformation as radiation sculpted new ecological patterns. Mutated scavenger birds filled the skies, irradiated canines prowled alleyways, and hostile abominations like Yao Guai wandered in from surrounding forests. Altering the predator hierarchy, and forcing human survivors into defensive, semi-nomadic lifestyles. The Capitol Rotunda, with its collapsed dome and shattered chambers, became a landmark for travelers navigating the urban maze, while the Washington Monument, though heavily damaged, remained an immovable pillar that stood defiantly against encroaching decay. The metro system, once the backbone of public transportation, evolved into a subterranean labyrinth of darkness, flooded tunnels, collapsed stations, and makeshift encampments inhabited by survivors, raider groups, and, eventually, colonies of feral ghouls who found refuge in its lightless depths. These underground passages would later form vital arteries for both settlers and hostile forces, granting access to zones otherwise cut off by rubble on the surface. Through the generations, the landscape's dangers evolved alongside the emergence of new post-war species. The first supermutants transported into the region by the actions of later factions would eventually proliferate. But even before their arrival, early mutations in local wildlife created unprecedented threats for isolated survivors. Radiation-resistant vegetation created rare but valuable food sources, though most plant life grew stunted, toxic, or barren. Scavenger communities formed in clusters around structurally sound buildings, like the pre-war Tenpenny Tower, which, built with reinforced civilian engineering, became a gleaming fortress visible for miles, a symbol of both stability and class division that would persist into the time of the lone wanderer. Meanwhile, the remains of Arlington, Georgetown, and downtown D.C. hardened into treacherous territories dominated by roaming scavenger bands, improvised militias, and early raiders who preyed on travelers moving between settlements. Over time, these factions established loose territories, guarding scrap, improvised agriculture patches, and hidden caches of pre-war supplies found in intact basements, panic rooms, or government bunkers. These early raider tribes lacked the ideological coherence of later organized factions, but their brutality and resource scarcity set the foundation for raider culture across the wasteland. The ruins of educational institutions and museums became critical sources of pre-war artifacts. The Arlington Library, long after its collection was reduced to a mixture of mold-eaten pages and barely legible texts, became a site of pilgrimage for knowledge seekers like the followers of the apocalypse and, later, individuals such as Scribe Yearling of the Brotherhood of Steel, who recognized the long-term significance of preserving humanity's cultural memory. Meanwhile, medical facilities like the old Red Racer factories, hospitals, and research labs offered valuable salvage for chem dealers, scavvers, and would-be doctors attempting to recreate pre-war pharmaceutical formulas from remaining stock or equipment. As survivalist groups adapted to the irradiated terrain, they established early trading routes that connected various strongholds around the Potomac, creating an embryonic economy based on ammo, food, scrap metal, and clean water, the last of which remained the most valuable resource until the activation of Project Purity over 2 centuries later. Through all this, the pre-war foundations of Washington, D.C. continued to shape the wasteland's power dynamics. Government bunkers like the one beneath the White House, later the L.O.B. Enterprise's ruins, occasionally unearthed caches of classified materials or prototype equipment that sparked conflict among scavengers. Deep within hidden research sites, forgotten technologies slept. Dormant sentry bots, sealed crates of energy weapons, experimental armor components, and archival data that would later fuel the ambitions of factions like the Brotherhood of Steel. Even the existence of the Pentagon, though reduced to a partially collapsed fortress, preserved the ideal of militarized order that would inspire the Brotherhood's establishment of the citadel. In this way, the old world had never truly died. It lingered in every foundation, every collapsed monument, every irradiated riverbank, setting the stage for the events that would unfold centuries later when the lone wanderer first stepped into the capital wasteland. And so, the pre-war capital region, once a beacon of American power, became the skeletal framework upon which the entire narrative of Fallout 3 would be built, its ruins telling the story of a civilization that fell in an instant, yet continued to define the lives, conflicts, and ambitions of every soul who walked its broken streets. The Great War of the 23rd of October 2077 was not merely the final act of global conflict, it was the instantaneous erasure of the world that once was, and nowhere was the devastation more symbolically profound or materially catastrophic than in Washington, D.C., where the very heart of American governance, military command, history, and national identity was annihilated in a matter of minutes, leaving behind a fractured skeleton of monuments and ruins that would define the capital wasteland for centuries to come. The war erupted early in the morning, catching the district at a moment when commuters, government officials, military personnel, and civilians were beginning their day, unaware that the world around them had only moments left before it dissolved into nuclear fire. Emergency klaxons blared across the city, broadcasting automated alerts from the nation's early warning systems. But panic spread faster than any coordinated response could be assembled. Traffic gridlocked instantly as residents abandoned vehicles in the streets, seeking shelter in basements, metro stations, and government bunkers that were either already sealed or far too limited in capacity to save more than a fraction of the population. Moments later, the sky ignited as multiple Chinese warheads detonated across strategic points in the district, some targeting federal institutions like the Capitol, the White House, and the Pentagon, others striking infrastructure hubs, military installations, and densely populated districts. The blasts transformed the city into a whirlwind of superheated air, collapsing structures, pulverized stone, flash-fried bodies, and radioactive dust that poured into the atmosphere in dense black waves, spreading outward into Maryland and Virginia as firestorms consumed entire neighborhoods within minutes. The first wave killed millions outright, vaporizing those within the immediate blast radius, while the shockwaves hurled vehicles, debris, and bodies through the air with catastrophic force. Buildings that had stood since the 18th and 19th centuries cracked open like brittle shells, their interiors collapsing downward into mounds of rubble, dust, and twisted steel beams. What followed in the minutes and hours after the blasts was a second wave of devastation, intense radiation, electrical grid collapse, ruptured gas lines, uncontrolled fires, and the total disintegration of communication networks as EMP surges fried circuits in military, civilian, and corporate systems. The Pentagon's defense matrix, once considered among the most sophisticated in the world, flickered into silence as its buried command lines melted under the nuclear heat, sealing hundreds of military personnel inside reinforced chambers that became tombs beneath the collapsing superstructure. The White House, a symbolic target for foreign adversaries, was annihilated almost entirely, leaving only scattered remnants of its subterranean structure. The Capitol building, though partially shielded by reinforced materials, had its dome shattered and blown outward, leaving a yawning cavity through which fire and smoke billowed for days as the ruins settled into their final, broken state. The Washington Monument survived the blast more intact than many other landmarks due to its unique structural composition, but its interior supports fractured, its stones loosened, and its peak blackened by radiation, ensuring that although it still stood as a towering obelisk after the war, it was deeply wounded and permanently compromised. Throughout the city, the metro tunnels shook violently under the impact, sending clouds of pulverized concrete cascading through ventilation shafts and collapsing major platforms. People who sought refuge underground often found themselves buried alive, trapped in darkness as fires raged above and air quality deteriorated into toxic chemical soup. In the hours following the nuclear detonations, fallout began to drift across the region in heavy plumes, settling onto the Potomac River and its tributaries, contaminating the water supply with lethal radiation levels. Fish and aquatic ecosystems died within hours, floating to the river's surface as bloated, glowing masses, while those who attempted to drink or wash with Potomac water fell ill immediately, suffering acute radiation poisoning that killed most survivors within days. The river, once central to the city's life, became a poisoned artery that no settlement could safely rely on for more than 2 centuries, shaping every survival strategy, conflict, and political movement that would later emerge in the wasteland. Outside the blast zones, survivors wandered in shock through smoldering streets, where cars burned uncontrollably, their melted frames fusing with the asphalt. Some attempted to flee the city, only to encounter blocked bridges, collapsed overpasses, or military checkpoints that had been overwhelmed by civilian crowds and had fallen into chaos the moment command structures dissolved. Without communications, no coordinated evacuation was possible. Military personnel who might have escorted civilians to safety were instead scattered, irradiated, or dead, leaving only fragmented pockets of survivors who clung to any structure that had survived the initial blasts. Among the ruins, government continuity plans, designed for long-term legislative and executive preservation, failed catastrophically. Bunkers intended to shelter senior officials were either destroyed by direct hits, never activated in time, or cut off from power and air systems due to infrastructural collapse, ensuring that the federal government effectively ceased to exist within hours of the war's onset. The Enclave, operating largely from remote offshore and underground facilities, survived not because of anything in Washington, but because they had already separated themselves from the nation they claimed to represent. Meanwhile, Vault 101 sealed itself shortly before the bombs fell, adhering strictly to the corporation's mandated policy of indefinite isolation, saving a small, curated population while condemning countless nearby residents who begged at its entrance to die in the blast winds outside. Vault 87, Vault 92, and Vault 108 were already closed and in various stages of experimentation, their populations sealed away from the immediate destruction but doomed to other fates, orchestrated by Vault-Tech's amoral scientific agenda. In the days following the war, those who survived the blasts faced environmental horrors that no amount of preparedness could mitigate. Black rain fell across the city as soot and radioactive particles condensed in the atmosphere, coating ruins and bodies alike in a fine, deadly residue. Fires smoldered beneath rubble piles for weeks, constantly reigniting as underground gas lines continued to rupture. The air grew thick with ash, chemical toxins, and decaying flesh, making respirable oxygen nearly non-existent in several districts. Animals that survived the initial blasts began mutating rapidly due to the extreme radiation saturation. Some died instantly, while others endured twisted genetic transformations that gave rise to early generations of radroaches, feral dog breeds, and grotesque scavenger birds. Those humans who survived but were exposed to lethal doses of radiation began the slow transformation into ghouls, first experiencing sickness, then necrosis, then the full-body mutation that left them hairless, peeling, and biologically immortal, yet psychologically unstable. Many ghouls retained their minds initially, but the trauma, starvation, and isolation pushed large numbers into bestial feral states that would persist for centuries. Within weeks, the district's survivors clustered into micro-communities around intact buildings, metro stations, and abandoned military outposts, living off whatever scavenged supplies they could retrieve from ruined storefronts or pre-war emergency caches. Without doctors, medicine, clean water, or reliable shelter, disease outbreaks ravaged these early survivor groups, wiping out entire pockets of population that had initially endured the blasts. As social order dissolved, early raider groups formed among the most desperate and violent survivors, establishing early territorial boundaries in downtown D.C., Georgetown, and the remains of DuPont Circle. These proto-raiders scavenged weapons from the ruins of police stations, National Guard depots, and residential homes, initiating patterns of violence, enslavement, and resource theft that would become defining aspects of capital wasteland culture. Children born in the earliest post-war decades grew up without any education, infrastructure, or access to pre-war knowledge, forming an entire lost generation that lived almost entirely feral, setting the cultural foundation for many of the hostile wasteland tribes encountered centuries later. By the end of the first post-war decade, Washington, D.C. had fully transitioned from a global capital to a silent ruin filled with unburied dead, irradiated husks of buildings, and the first stirrings of mutated wildlife. By the end of the first century, its landmarks were half swallowed by sand, rubble, and creeping vegetation. And by the time the Lone Wanderer emerged from Vault 101 inches 2277, 2 full centuries after the Great War, the capital wasteland remained a living monument to the exact moment civilization ended, its every broken structure still bearing the scars of the day the bombs fell, its every survivor shaped by the long shadow of a war that lasted only hours, but transformed the world forever. In the chaotic aftermath of the Great War, the region that would later be known as the Capital Wasteland entered a prolonged period of collapse marked by radiation sickness, famine, societal amnesia, and the total breakdown of coherent governance, as the once meticulously planned urban, suburban, and governmental grids surrounding Washington, D.C., devolved into scattered pockets of terrified survivors who emerged from makeshift shelters, half-destroyed basements, metro tunnels, storm drains, and the skeletal frames of office complexes, only to find a world stripped of infrastructure, clean water, surviving institutions, and coordinated security forces. And in this vacuum of authority, the earliest post-war human groupings formed around basic survival rather than ideology, gradually hardening into distinct factions whose descendants would shape the scenario encountered by the Lone Wanderer centuries later. In the first few years, survival was so precarious that no stable communities appeared, and groups often survived only by raiding others for food, medical supplies, or weapons. leading to the proto-raider bands that historians of the wasteland later identified as the earliest tribes of organized brutality, composed of individuals who had lost families, resources, and often sanity under the pressures of radiation exposure, starvation, and the psychological collapse triggered by witnessing the death of a nation. And these early raider packs roamed the ruins of downtown D.C., Georgetown, and the collapsing neighborhoods east of the Potomac, scavenging for anything: pre-war ration crates, sealed military MREs, or water pooled in undetonated municipal reservoirs, while the absence of any unifying leadership meant these groups constantly fractured, reformed, and clashed in shifting power struggles that left entire metro stations littered with improvised barricades and skeletal remains. Parallel to these violent clans were small survivalist enclaves, many of which emerged around individuals with mechanical, agricultural, or medical knowledge. And though their numbers dwindled heavily in the first decades, those that endured laid the foundations for post-war civilization in the region, exemplified by future settlement sites like Canterbury Commons, Arafu, and the earliest trading camps that became the backbone of the Capital Wasteland's caravan network, a system that arose not out of commercial ambition but necessity, as settlements were too small and isolated to produce all essential goods, forcing them to exchange scavenged ammunition, tools, and food with others across perilous, mutant-infested terrain. At the same time, the first signs of post-war mutation appeared, most dramatically in the early FEV-mutated supermutants originating from Vault 87, although at this stage their numbers were still limited and their purpose unclear, as the facility's experiments gradually produced the first generation of sterile but physically formidable beings who would later kidnap humans to forcibly expand their ranks, and their early appearances in the wasteland, terrifying to survivors unprepared for massive, regenerating humanoids with preternatural strength, contributed to the collapse of many struggling communities. During this turbulent period, the remnants of pre-war military and governmental figures scattered into obscurity, with some dying from radiation poisoning or violent collapse, while others attempted and failed to preserve political structures, leaving behind abandoned safe houses, caches of weapons later discovered by wastelanders, and scattered documents that eventually fed the myths of lost government bunkers waiting to be reactivated, myths that would influence both settlers and raiders for generations. Meanwhile, the D.C. metro system became both refuge and death trap, as survivors fled the irradiated surface only to confront darkness, disease, and growing territorial disputes underground, with these early metro-dwelling groups eventually forming the ancestors of the present-day tunnel tribes and small subterranean communities who maintained a fragile existence cut off from the surface world. As decades passed, the early chaos began to stabilize into recognizable emerging societies, with raider clans coalescing into ideologically distinct factions defined by brutality, ritualism, or opportunism, ranging from savage groups that adorned themselves with the bones of past victims to more organized bands that controlled key trade routes, bridges, and metro entrances, effectively taxing or extorting anyone attempting safe passage. At the same time, scavengers and wanderers became increasingly interdependent, as scarcity drove them to form temporary alliances, which over time solidified into enduring settlements that maintained just enough defense and agricultural production to avoid absorption by raiders, helping transform the capital wasteland from a zone of pure anarchy into a patchwork of micro-societies with distinct customs, dialects, and survival strategies, and these evolving communities eventually interface through small groups of intrepid merchants who re-established long-distance travel, the ancestors of caravan families like the Crimson Caravan affiliated traders who later operated between Canterbury Commons and Rivet City, carrying the lifeblood of regional commerce on Brahmin caravans that risked radiation storms, raider ambushes, and mutant attacks to supply settlements with ammunition, pre-war tech, and news from distant outposts. As this fragile economic network formed, new varieties of mutated wildlife, rad scorpions, molar rats, feral ghouls, mirrorlurks, and future abominations like Yao Guai expanded across the region unchecked, forcing human groups to develop territorial boundaries defined not by political borders but by environmental hazards, altering settlement patterns and contributing to the isolation that became characteristic of the post-war DC region. Concurrently, the earliest ghoul communities began to coalesce, made up of individuals who survived the Great War in shelters or areas of intense but non-lethal radiation, and whose resulting condition provoked fear, revulsion, and violence from many human survivors, pushing them into the ruins, metro tunnels, and abandoned industrial complexes where they lived in uneasy coexistence with feral populations. And though these early ghoul groups lacked the later social structures of underworld, they represented one of the first non-human societies to emerge in the capital wasteland. Meanwhile, the ruins of major pre-war structures, such as the Pentagon, the White House bunker system, and the partially intact naval aircraft carrier that would one day become Rivet City, became contested spaces, scavenged relentlessly for weapons, medical supplies, and structural materials. And though no coherent political force controlled them at this stage, their strategic importance would later draw the attention of larger factions, such as the Brotherhood of Steel, the Enclave, and Rivet City's future founders. As the decades continued, patterns of conflict solidified into territorial expectations, with certain raider groups establishing strongholds in heavily ruined areas, like the Mall, Anacostia Crossing, and the old military checkpoints along major roadways, while early settlers reclaimed small agricultural plots along the less irradiated outskirts, fostering a tenuous stability that would last into the era preceding the Lone Wanderer. And by the time the Brotherhood of Steel first entered the region in the late 22nd century, the capital wasteland had already formed a hardened cultural identity defined by resilience, suspicion, and fragmented governance, where each community functioned as a self-contained microstate, cooperating only when essential and negotiating constantly for survival as raiders, mutants, environmental hazards, and scarcity continued to throttle any attempt at large-scale unification. In this complex landscape of post-war reorganization, every major faction encountered in Fallout 3 can trace its origins to these early centuries of collapse and adaptation, a period when desperation drove human behavior to its most brutal and inventive extremes, setting the stage for the dramatic political, military, and ideological conflicts that would unfold when new powers, the Brotherhood of Steel, the Enclave, and eventually the Lone Wanderer, entered this centuries-old struggle to define the future of the capital wasteland. The Brotherhood of Steel, long considered one of the most influential and secretive factions in the post-apocalyptic United States, emerged from the ashes of pre-war military and technological knowledge with a singular purpose: the preservation and control of advanced technology. And its evolution from a regional West Coast movement into a decisive force on the East Coast reflects both the adaptability of its members and the ideological schisms that would define the capital wasteland, beginning with its origins during the aftermath of the Resource Wars and the supermutant uprisings that devastated Southern California, founded by Roger Maxson, a U.S. Army officer stationed at the Mariposa military base during the height of FEV experimentation. The early Brotherhood formed as a response to the collapse of centralized military authority and the dangers posed by unregulated technological experimentation, most notably the creation of the forced evolutionary virus, which had already begun to turn humans into monstrous mutants in a secluded research facility, leading to Maxson's fateful decision to purge the base of infected personnel and declare the remnants of his unit a self-contained order devoted to controlling and protecting dangerous pre-war knowledge, a move that would simultaneously preserve invaluable technological expertise and alienate them from any remaining government or civilian authority, cementing the Brotherhood's ethos of separation from the chaos engulfing post-war society. The original West Coast Brotherhood, stationed initially in the high desert of California, quickly solidified its hierarchical structure, codified doctrines, and strict training regimens for new initiates, emphasizing martial discipline, technological literacy, and the understanding that all advanced knowledge carried inherent risk, with failure to control it threatening the survival of humanity itself, a philosophy that Maxson passed down to successive generations. By the late 22nd century, internal dissent and regional necessity prompted the expansion of Brotherhood chapters eastward, motivated by rumors of intact military installations, vaults, and laboratories rich in pre-war technology, including the Pentagon, the Jefferson Memorial, and the underutilized naval infrastructure along the Potomac, which offered both strategic value and repositories of lost knowledge essential to the Brotherhood's mission. It was during this eastward expansion that Owen Lyons, the son of Maxson's direct disciples, led the first significant incursion into the capital wasteland, bringing with him a small contingent of disciplined soldiers trained in both combat and salvage, whose primary objectives were the identification, recovery, and protection of any remaining technological artifacts, while simultaneously asserting Brotherhood authority over fledgling local settlements that might otherwise misuse advanced weaponry or energy systems, a delicate operation that required balancing martial discipline with diplomacy in a region already fragmented by raiders, ghouls, mutated wildlife, and early survivalist enclaves. The discovery of the Pentagon's subterranean vaults, which contained archives, armored facilities, and prototype military hardware, represented a turning point for the East Coast Brotherhood, providing a secure headquarters known as the Citadel and serving as both an operational center and ideological beacon for Lyons chapter, which over the subsequent decades developed into a distinct regional faction while maintaining loose philosophical continuity with the West Coast leadership, yet diverging in its approach to human interaction, often exhibiting a greater emphasis on cooperation with non-Brotherhood communities, partially out of necessity in the densely populated and contested capital wasteland. This philosophical divergence ultimately led to the infamous split between Lyons's chapter and the West Coast Brotherhood, giving rise to the Outcasts, a faction of traditionalists who rejected Lyons's cooperative policies, insisting that humanity's survival demanded strict isolation, uncompromising control over technology, and the repudiation of all non-Brotherhood influence, a schism that would echo through the region for decades and shape factional politics encountered by the Lone Wanderer. Throughout this period, Lyons's efforts were complicated by the persistent threat of the Enclave, rogue supermutants from Vault 87, hostile raider gangs, and the logistical challenges of maintaining supply lines and training regimens in a fractured landscape, forcing the East Coast Brotherhood to innovate in tactics, weaponry, and morale, leading to the development of regional adaptations of power armor, the establishment of long-range scouting networks, and the creation of strategic alliances with settlements such as Rivet City and Megaton, who benefited from the Brotherhood's protection while respecting its authority. By the time the Lone Wanderer emerged from Vault 101, Lyons's Brotherhood had cemented itself as a stabilizing yet militarized presence within the capital wasteland, enforcing a careful balance of technological preservation, martial oversight, and regional governance, while remaining ideologically distinct from its outcast cousins on the West Coast, and its interventions, whether in support of local communities or in preparation for larger conflicts against the Enclave, represented the culmination of over a century of deliberate organizational expansion, doctrinal evolution, and cautious engagement with a post-war society struggling to define itself in the shadow of 2 centuries of nuclear devastation, ensuring that the Brotherhood would not merely be a relic of pre-war military hierarchy, but a defining power in the fate of the capital wasteland, capable of shaping both the political landscape and the survival strategies of countless human, mutant, and ghoul populations, setting the stage for the conflicts, alliances, and decisions that the Lone Wanderer would encounter during their journey to activate Project Purity, confront the Enclave, and interact with the ideological legacy left by Maxon, Lyons, and the countless Brotherhood soldiers who had dedicated their lives to preserving a vision of humanity's technological continuity, even amidst the ruins of civilization. Project Purity stands as one of the most ambitious and symbolically resonant scientific endeavors in the history of the capital wasteland, representing both humanity's capacity for ingenuity and its vulnerability to ideological, environmental, and political forces, and its story is inseparable from the lives of Catherine and James, pre-war visionaries whose work began in the ruins of Washington, D.C. Long before the Lone Wanderer would emerge from Vault 101, Catherine, a gifted engineer with unparalleled expertise in nuclear and hydroengineering, first conceived the idea of purifying the Potomac River as a means of restoring potable water to a region devastated by centuries of radiation, infrastructural collapse, and toxic fallout, believing that the revitalization of clean water could catalyze not only the physical survival of the wasteland's human population, but also the moral restoration of a society fractured by war, desperation, and environmental collapse. And she spent decades designing a massive purification system capable of filtering and decontaminating millions of gallons daily, using advanced reactors, filtration grids, and the integration of pre-war hydrological studies long thought lost. James, her partner and collaborator, brought political acumen, leadership experience, and technical skill to the project, overseeing the logistical and bureaucratic challenges associated with assembling a team in a region still racked by scattered raiders, mutants, and resource scarcity, and he was responsible for securing critical locations, negotiating for salvageable pre-war technology, and maintaining the secrecy of Project Purity from hostile factions such as the Enclave, who had long recognized the potential of a functional water purification system both to gain leverage over the wasteland's population and to control a vital strategic resource. The Jefferson Memorial was selected as the project's central site, due to its relative structural integrity, strategic position along the Potomac, and proximity to dormant pre-war infrastructure that could supply power and structural support. And over decades, the site became a fortress laboratory hybrid, its iconic columns and rotunda framing massive machinery, pipes, filtration chambers, and nuclear reactors, while Catherine directed teams of engineers, chemists, and technicians who labored tirelessly to translate her designs into operational reality, often in the face of continuous sabotage attempts, environmental hazards, and the encroaching influence of radiation-mutated creatures that had begun populating the surrounding region. However, Project Purity's progress was abruptly interrupted by the arrival of the Enclave, whose presence in the capital wasteland had been growing steadily as they sought to reassert dominance over surviving American territory, and their attempts to seize the project were only partially successful due to James's foresight in securing vital components and Catherine's insistence on maintaining strict operational protocols. Yet the confrontation led to her tragic death at the hands of Enclave forces, an event that not only deprived the project of its leading visionary but also destabilized the team's morale, forcing James into a reluctant retreat and ultimately driving him into voluntary seclusion within Vault 101, a decision that would postpone the project's completion by decades and place the responsibility for its eventual activation squarely on the shoulders of his offspring, the Lone Wanderer, born into a vault, deliberately isolated to ensure the survival of one last genetically and socially intact generation capable of carrying the project forward. Despite Catherine's death and James's retreat, the design and theoretical underpinnings of Project Purity remained intact, encoded in schematics, journals, and pre-war data recovered from both the Washington, D.C. archives and remote government research facilities, and these records later guided the Lone Wanderer through a complex series of engineering, combat, and ethical decisions as they navigated the challenges of assembling the remaining components, rallying potential allies, and ultimately confronting both the Enclave and the moral imperatives of wielding a system capable of delivering clean water to tens of thousands, while simultaneously upsetting the fragile post-war balance of power, including the political and military interests of the Brotherhood of Steel, independent settlements such as Rivet City, and the scattered remnants of the NCR and other regional powers. The project's technical achievements, including the filtration of radiological contaminants, integration of pre-war nuclear reactors, and the unprecedented scale of the purification grid, became legendary not only for their ambition but for the precision and perseverance required to implement them under conditions of scarcity, danger, and near-constant threat from hostile forces, and the successful activation of Project Purity, centuries after its conception, served as both a literal and symbolic purification of the capital wasteland, restoring potable water to thousands, enabling the expansion and sustainability of settlements, reducing disease and radiation exposure, and providing a tangible demonstration that, despite 2 centuries of collapse and fragmentation, humanity retained the ability to harness science, engineering, and moral purpose to reconstruct some semblance of a functioning society. Throughout this process, the story of Catherine and James, their sacrifices, vision, and foresight became mythologized among survivors, inspiring a narrative that emphasized the persistence of knowledge, the necessity of courage in the face of overwhelming adversity, and the ethical responsibility inherent in controlling technology capable of shaping life and civilization setting the stage for the lone wanderer's critical role as both inheritor and executor of a project, whose success would ultimately determine the survival, cohesion, and ideological trajectory of the capital wasteland for generations to come. Vault 101, one of the many Vault-Tec facilities scattered across the pre-war United States, represents a unique microcosm of post-apocalyptic social engineering, a deliberately sealed experiment in authoritarian control and survivalist planning, whose strict policies of isolation and self-sufficiency would define the early life of the lone wanderer and profoundly shape the socio-political landscape of the capital wasteland upon their eventual emergence. Constructed with the ostensible purpose of providing a safe haven from nuclear annihilation, Vault 101 was designed to remain closed indefinitely, a permanent refuge in which a carefully curated population could live for generations without ever interacting with the outside world, a design decision reflecting Vault-Tec's broader experimental philosophy of testing human behavior under extreme social, environmental, and psychological constraints, and one which incorporated a variety of mechanisms to maintain population compliance, including strict oversight by the overseer, regulated resource distribution, mandatory participation in the GOAT, Generalized Occupational Aptitude Test, and an ideological framework emphasizing loyalty, obedience, and a moral narrative that framed the outside world as irredeemably hostile and untrustworthy. Within Vault 101, daily life was governed by a rigid schedule of work, recreation, education, and civic duties, designed to maintain both order and the perception of stability, with the overseer exercising near absolute authority over all aspects of community functioning, including rationing, security, medical intervention, and population management, while simultaneously withholding any substantive knowledge of the world beyond the vault's reinforced steel doors, ensuring that generations of residents were psychologically and culturally conditioned to view isolation as both desirable and necessary, and the ethical implications of such control were central to the Vault's experimental purpose, allowing Vault-Tec to observe the long-term effects of paternalistic authoritarianism, generational obedience, and the suppression of curiosity and autonomy within a completely sealed environment. The Vault's isolation policy extended to physical security, with airlocks, reinforced blast doors, and surveillance mechanisms preventing unauthorized egress, and a security apparatus capable of deterring or eliminating individuals who attempted to breach the perimeter, a design that fostered a culture of fear and dependency, while simultaneously preserving life from the irradiated, mutant-filled wasteland outside, yet paradoxically creating conditions in which social tension, personal rebellion, and moral dilemmas were intensified due to the lack of external influence and the necessity of intra-community conflict resolution. The presence of the overseer, as both guardian and de facto ruler, created a complex hierarchy in which loyalty, favoritism, and the strategic allocation of resources shaped interpersonal relationships and societal stratification. And the position's moral ambiguity highlighted the tension between survival imperatives and ethical governance, particularly as the overseer navigated challenges such as ration scarcity, illness outbreaks, and disputes among residents, all while maintaining the Vault's isolationist policy. The GOAT, a mandatory vocational and moral aptitude assessment administered to all adolescents, functioned as both a tool for educational placement and a mechanism for reinforcing Vault-Tec's ideological objectives, categorizing individuals in ways that limited social mobility, reinforced hierarchy, and created an early sense of purpose tied intrinsically to obedience and conformity, while simultaneously discouraging critical engagement with the outside world or independent ethical reasoning, an approach that would later have profound consequences for the lone wanderer when confronted with the moral and existential complexities of the capital wasteland. Over time, subtle fissures began to appear in the social fabric of Vault 101, as younger generations, including Amata, questioned the rationale behind strict isolation, the morality of overseer authority, and the legitimacy of life lived entirely under imposed constraints, leading to acts of minor rebellion, secret exploration, and the slow development of a consciousness that viewed the world outside not as irredeemably hostile, but as a space containing both danger and opportunity, a realization that ultimately catalyzed the chain of events, forcing the Vault to confront its long-standing isolationist doctrine. The culmination of these tensions occurred with the disappearance of James, father of the lone wanderer, whose unexpected departure to pursue Project Purity in the irradiated capital wasteland shattered the perceived invulnerability of the Vault's doors, prompted the first large-scale breach of its enforced isolation policy, and revealed the limitations of Vault-Tech's social experiment in controlling human behavior, illustrating that even a meticulously designed environment of security, obedience, and ideological conditioning could not indefinitely suppress innate curiosity, familial bonds, and the moral imperative to intervene in the broader struggle for survival outside. A lesson that would resonate profoundly throughout the life of the lone wanderer and inform the ethical, strategic, and existential decisions faced when stepping into the fractured, irradiated, and politically complex landscape of the capital wasteland. Thus, Vault 101's history is inseparable from the narrative of Fallout 3, serving not only as the literal starting point of the lone wanderer's journey, but also as a living demonstration of the limits of authoritarian social engineering, the consequences of isolationism, and the enduring tension between safety and freedom, between obedience and moral agency, a microcosm that shaped psychological, moral, and tactical framework of the game's protagonist, while simultaneously highlighting the broader philosophical questions that govern human survival, social cohesion, and technological responsibility in a post-apocalyptic world still haunted by the legacy of the pre-war civilization that designed both the vaults and the very weapons that ended it. The emergence of the lone wanderer from Vault 101 into the irradiated and politically fragmented capital wasteland represents not only the literal beginning of their journey, but also a complex initiation into a world shaped by centuries of collapse, mutation, human resilience, and ideological conflict, as the protagonist is immediately confronted with the full spectrum of survival challenges that define post-apocalyptic Washington, D.C. Upon leaving the Vault, the lone wanderer first encounters the vestiges of pre-war urban infrastructure, including collapsed streets, irradiated rivers, and skeletal monuments such as the partially ruined Washington Monument and the Mall, each of which serves as both a navigational landmark and a historical testament to the civilization that preceded the bombs. Yet these ruins are inhabited by a mix of hostile and cooperative entities that test the wanderer's moral, strategic, and tactical judgment from the outset, from hostile raider gangs and feral ghouls lurking in metro tunnels, to scavenger communities and friendly survivors seeking assistance or protection. establishing a narrative environment in which every decision carries both immediate and long-term consequences. Early interactions with settlements, such as Megaton, a community built around the remains of a pre-war nuclear bomb, introduced the player to the complex socio-political networks that have arisen from centuries of survival, where human groups negotiate, trade, and occasionally conflict over resources, shelter, and influence, and where individuals like Lucas Sims, the town sheriff, exemplify the delicate balance between authority and cooperation in maintaining order within these micro-societies, demonstrating that governance in the wasteland is contingent upon charisma, diplomacy, and force applied judiciously rather than inherited through formal structures. As the Lone Wanderer explores further, they encounter factions such as the Brotherhood of Steel, whose militarized presence and ideological mission to preserve pre-war technology compel the protagonist to navigate alliances and rivalries with groups that wield advanced weaponry, power armor, and institutional knowledge, while also negotiating with more opportunistic and decentralized forces, including early raider groups, wandering caravans, and the followers of the apocalypse, whose humanitarian efforts provide guidance, education, and medical support to the scattered population, highlighting the diversity of ethical frameworks and survival strategies operative within the wasteland. The protagonist's early journey also involves encounters with the region's persistent environmental hazards, from radiation pockets and irradiated water sources to hostile mutant species, such as supermutants, emerging from Vault 87, feral dogs, rad scorpions, and other mutated fauna whose presence complicates travel, foraging, and settlement interaction, reinforcing the constant tension between exploration, resource acquisition, and risk management that defines life in the wasteland. The Lone Wanderer's initial objectives, including locating James, their father, thrust them into the complex political and technological struggles surrounding Project Purity, placing them at the intersection of competing interests, including the Enclave, the Brotherhood of Steel, independent settlements, and the emergent power of the capital wasteland's inhabitants themselves, while also introducing critical figures such as Three Dog, the voice of Galaxy News Radio, whose broadcasts provide both narrative context and social cohesion across distant communities, framing the broader stakes of survival, ideology, and moral responsibility across the region. As the journey unfolds, the Lone Wanderer must navigate multifaceted questlines that blend combat, diplomacy, exploration, and ethical decision-making, from disarming threats in Megaton, assisting or opposing local raider operations, engaging with mutated creatures, uncovering pre-war caches of weapons, and negotiating with faction leaders, all of which cumulatively illustrate the depth of societal reconstruction in the wasteland and the impact of individual agency in shaping emergent power structures. The exploration of the capital wasteland reveals not only the physical remnants of civilization, but also the psychological and cultural adaptations of its survivors, where each settlement, road, and ruined structure contains evidence of prior conflicts, innovative survival strategies, and attempts to restore semblances of governance, commerce, and community, and where the Lone Wanderer's actions, alliances, and choices have the potential to alter the balance of power, influence the survival of entire populations, and determine the trajectory of Project Purity, whose success or failure embodies the broader moral and technological imperatives of restoring life, order, and hope to a world still defined by the catastrophic legacies of the Great War, radiation, and centuries of societal collapse. Ultimately, the wanderer's journey into the capital wasteland is both a personal quest and a lens through which the intricate tapestry of post-apocalyptic society, environmental hazards, factional politics, human resilience, and the enduring presence of pre-war technological legacies can be examined, demonstrating how individual agency interacts with historical contingency to shape the survival, ethics, and ideological future of a region struggling to reconcile the past's devastation with the potential for renewal and civilization's fragile return. The Enclave's re-emergence in the capital wasteland represents the resurgence of pre-war federal authority in its most authoritarian, technologically advanced, and morally unyielding form, as the organization, long thought diminished following the initial post-war chaos on the West Coast, rebuilt its strength in secret, leveraging remaining military assets, knowledge of pre-war nuclear and chemical technology, and a vision of restoring a United States governed exclusively by those it deemed genetically and ideologically pure, and their return to the region was meticulously planned to capitalize on both the chaos and the opportunity presented by the fractured settlements, the presence of Project Purity, and the weakened oversight of the Brotherhood of Steel, operating from hidden bases such as Raven Rock, a heavily fortified underground facility designed to withstand nuclear attack and sustain prolonged military operations. The Enclave maintained a cadre of officers, scientists, and soldiers loyal to the vision of a restored America under centralized command, complete with advanced power armor, energy weaponry, and experimental technologies that gave them a decisive tactical advantage over local militias, settlements, and other factions, allowing them to assert influence not through negotiation, but through the threat of annihilation and the strategic seizure of critical infrastructure, including water sources, transportation hubs, and high-value pre-war military and research sites. President John Henry Eden, a sophisticated AI programmed with the persona and governing philosophy of the pre-war executive branch, became the symbolic and operational head of the East Coast Enclave, embodying both continuity with the federal government that had ceased to exist decades earlier and the cold, utilitarian ideology that drove Enclave policy, including the systematic culling of irradiated populations, the expansion of genetic selection programs, and the monopolization of technology to enforce political and environmental control, while Colonel Autumn, Eden's field commander, executed military operations on the surface, directing the Enclave's forces to secure strategic positions, recover critical components of Project Purity, and neutralize threats such as the Brotherhood of Steel, independent settlements, and any individual or group capable of challenging Enclave supremacy. Their return to the capital wasteland was facilitated by advanced pre-war transport infrastructure, covert surveillance, and intelligence gathering, allowing the Enclave to maintain operational secrecy and strike decisively against isolated communities before they could coordinate resistance. And this calculated approach enabled the Enclave to establish a pattern of dominance in which fear, technological superiority, and the promise of order became central instruments of governance in the post-war region. Throughout this period, the Enclave's strategic goals intersected directly with Project Purity, as the organization recognized that control of a fully operational water purification system would confer unprecedented leverage over the region's population, enabling them to manipulate settlements dependent on potable water, enforce compliance through selective distribution, and further their broader ideological objectives of restoring a sanitized, pure America, while simultaneously eliminating the effects of radiation-induced mutation, which they considered both a threat to human genetic integrity and a challenge to their authority. The Enclave's operations were not limited to open combat, as covert infiltration, technological sabotage, and psychological warfare were employed to destabilize local settlements, undermine rival factions, and isolate influential individuals, culminating in a complex web of espionage, coercion, and confrontation designed to ensure both the acquisition of Project Purity and the consolidation of political control across the capital wasteland. The return of the Enclave also catalyzed alliances and countermeasures among local forces, forcing the Brotherhood of Steel, Rivet City, and independent settlements to coordinate intelligence, defensive operations, and resource allocation in ways unprecedented since the first post-war generations, as the existential threat posed by a technologically superior, highly organized, and ideologically unyielding enemy underscored the stakes of the lone wanderer's emerging journey and the moral, strategic, and technological dilemmas surrounding the use and protection of Project Purity. By the time the lone wanderer began actively pursuing their father James and unraveling the complexities of Project Purity, the Enclave had already solidified its presence, with Eden's directives shaping operational priorities, Colonel Autumn's forces controlling key approaches to the Jefferson Memorial, and covert operatives embedded within settlements and industrial sites, creating a pervasive atmosphere of surveillance, threat, and tension that defined every interaction, forced every strategic choice, and ensured that any advancement toward completing the purifier required careful negotiation of combat, diplomacy, and ethical judgment. Ultimately, the Enclave's return represents the fusion of pre-war military, technological, and ideological power with post-war opportunism, positioning them as both the central antagonist and the embodiment of a particular vision of order and control. A vision in which the fate of the capital wasteland, its survivors, and the implementation of Project Purity hangs in precarious balance, awaiting the decisive intervention of the lone wanderer, whose actions would determine whether the Enclave's authoritarian ambitions would be realized, resisted, or destroyed, thereby shaping the ethical, political, and environmental trajectory of the region for generations to come. The Jefferson Memorial, an iconic symbol of pre-war American governance and architectural achievement, became the central arena for one of the most critical conflicts in the capital wasteland, as control over its facilities, including the infrastructure of Project Purity, transformed it into a strategic focal point for both the Enclave's authoritarian ambitions and the efforts of the lone wanderer and allied forces to restore access to clean water and safeguard the region's remaining populations. The struggle began in earnest when the Enclave, recognizing that the purifier's activation would both solidify their power and challenge the viability of their long-term plans, deployed heavily armed units under Colonel Autumn to seize the Jefferson Memorial, establishing fortified positions, cutting off surrounding settlements, and integrating advanced surveillance systems to monitor both the river's approaches and key pathways leading into and out of the memorial, while simultaneously attempting to neutralize defenders, disrupt engineering work, and prevent any local militia or allied faction from organizing effective resistance, creating a tense and lethal standoff. where the balance of technological control directly correlated with strategic dominance in the wasteland. James, the original architect of Project Purity and the Lone Wanderer's father, returned at this critical juncture, providing expertise, moral authority, and critical knowledge of the Purifier's operations, but his presence alone could not counter the Enclave's superior firepower, tactical coordination, and relentless pursuit of dominance, forcing the Lone Wanderer to navigate a complex series of combat engagements, stealth operations, and strategic choices in order to both protect their father and secure the infrastructure necessary for activation, while simultaneously managing alliances with the Brotherhood of Steel, Rivet City, and sympathetic wasteland communities whose cooperation was essential to offsetting the Enclave's technological and military advantage. The memorial itself, partially ruined yet structurally intact, provided both opportunities and challenges, with its rotunda, underground chambers, and river access points offering defensive positions, supply caches, and operational space for Project Purity's massive filtration system, while also imposing significant logistical constraints, including limited ingress and egress routes, vulnerability to artillery and energy weapon fire, and the constant threat of sabotage or infiltration by Enclave operatives who had embedded themselves within surrounding settlements and technical facilities, requiring a coordinated defense strategy that integrated combat proficiency, tactical ingenuity, and the ethical obligation to protect civilians and the fragile post-war environment from collateral damage. Throughout the struggle, the Lone Wanderer's decisions, including the prioritization of targets, engagement of Rumenti, Enclave forces, and management of allies, directly influenced both immediate outcomes and the longer-term operational integrity of Project Purity, as mismanagement could result in system damage, personnel casualties, or the loss of critical components, highlighting the convergence of technological, military, and moral challenges that define leadership and agency in a post-apocalyptic context, and illustrating the intricate dependencies between human skill, environmental conditions, and mechanical systems in a world where centuries of neglect, mutation, and radiation have rendered survival contingent upon both knowledge and ethical judgment. Beyond the tactical engagements, the struggle for the Jefferson Memorial also represented an ideological confrontation, as the Enclave's vision of control, genetic purity, and centralized authority collided with the Lone Wanderer's emergent role as a custodian of Project Purity, embodying an ethic of resource sharing, technological responsibility, and cooperation with diverse wasteland communities, thus framing the battle not simply as a conflict over space and infrastructure, but as a defining moment in the ongoing struggle to determine whether the capital wasteland would be governed through fear, exclusion, and authoritarian power, or through collaboration, moral accountability, and the restoration of essential life-sustaining resources. The culmination of this struggle saw James's ultimate sacrifice, a calculated act that ensured the continued operation of Project Purity while demonstrating the profound personal costs inherent in leadership, innovation, and ethical responsibility in a devastated environment, and the Lone Wanderer's ability to synthesize the lessons of Vault 101, the guidance of allies, and their own emerging understanding of technological, social, and moral imperatives became the decisive factor in overcoming the Enclave's attempt to monopolize control, underscoring the intertwined nature of personal agency, technological mastery, and social cohesion in shaping the future of the capital wasteland. with the Jefferson Memorial standing not only as a physical bastion of survival and renewal, but also as a symbolic site where the struggle for ethical governance, resource stewardship, and the restoration of human dignity was enacted in its most immediate and consequential form. The journey to the Garden of Eden Creation Kit, or GEC, represents one of the most critical phases in the Lone Wanderer's quest, intertwining survival, exploration, and ethical decision-making with the broader history of the capital wasteland, and serving as both a literal and symbolic path toward restoring life, stability, and the potential for future civilization in a region long defined by devastation, mutation, and fragmented societies. The GECK itself, a pre-war technological marvel designed to provide all the necessary resources, genetic materials, and environmental engineering capabilities to create a sustainable community from barren or irradiated land, was originally intended for Vault 87, a facility notorious for its underground experiments with the forced evolutionary virus, which produced generations of sterile yet physically formidable supermutants, underscoring the duality of human innovation as both life-giving and life-threatening, and situating the GECK as a tool whose application required exceptional moral and technical acumen, a responsibility that fell squarely on the Lone Wanderer upon leaving Vault 101. The journey toward Vault 87, and by extension the GECK, is fraught with environmental, social, and tactical challenges, including navigating irradiated terrain, abandoned industrial complexes, and mutated wildlife such as molorats, radscorpions, Yao Guai, and feral ghouls, whose presence complicates travel, tests combat readiness, and demands adaptive resource management, while also contending with the region's human factions, from raider bands and opportunistic scavengers to organized forces like the Brotherhood of Steel and the Enclave, whose own agendas intersect with or oppose the Lone Wanderer's objectives in ways that require negotiation, strategy, and occasionally coercion. Along the route, the protagonist encounters critical settlements, such as Little Lamplight, a community composed entirely of children who have adapted unique governance structures, social hierarchies, and survival strategies to the harsh realities of a post-apocalyptic environment, providing both narrative depth and essential support as alliances formed with such settlements yield information, safe passage, and occasionally equipment vital to advancing toward Vault 87 and retrieving the GECK, highlighting the interplay between microsocietal dynamics and the larger survivalist framework of the capital wasteland. The history of Vault 87 itself is inseparable from the legacy of the Master, the architect of the original FEV experiments, whose ideology and scientific methodology had catastrophic consequences that resonated across decades, producing supermutants whose emergence in the wasteland created existential threats, disrupted local communities, and established long-term hazards that the Lone Wanderer must confront, integrating lessons of past failures into their strategic planning, while simultaneously managing the moral responsibility associated with controlling the GECK's power. This journey also involves capturing and neutralizing key threats, navigating abandoned pre-war military outposts, disarming traps, deciphering technical schematics, and understanding the operational mechanisms of the GECK, all of which are complicated by the persistent presence of the Enclave and rogue supermutant factions seeking to exploit or destroy the device, reflecting the confluence of environmental hazard, technological mastery, and factional politics that defines much of the capital wasteland's post-war narrative. The lone wanderer's interactions along this road, including their tactical decisions, ethical judgments, and ability to rally allies, serve as a microcosm for the broader challenges of restoring sustainability to a region fractured by war, radiation, and social collapse, illustrating the delicate balance between technological empowerment, ethical stewardship, and the necessity of strategic foresight in achieving outcomes that preserve life, protect communities, and counteract the predations of authoritarian or destructive forces. Ultimately, the successful acquisition and deployment of the GEC becomes both a turning point in the lone wanderer's personal journey and a catalyst for regional transformation, enabling the purification of water, the restoration of arable land, and the empowerment of settlements to rebuild independently, while simultaneously confronting the moral imperatives and strategic consequences inherent in wielding a device capable of shaping the ecological and socio-political future of the capital wasteland, a legacy that intertwines the protagonist's agency with the enduring consequences of pre-war scientific ambition, post-war survivalist innovation, and the ongoing struggle for control, stability, and life in a world still haunted by the ghosts of nuclear devastation and human ambition. The fall of the Enclave in the capital wasteland, punctuated by the lone wanderer's daring escape from Raven Rock, represents a decisive turning point in the region's post-war history, demonstrating the interplay between technological supremacy, tactical acumen, and moral decision-making, as the protagonist confronts an authoritarian remnant of pre-war governance that sought to impose control over the devastated landscape through intimidation, monopolization of resources, and the ruthless application of power. Raven Rock itself, a fortified underground military installation constructed to serve as a command center for the Enclave's resurgence, embodies both the strategic sophistication and the ideological rigidity of the organization, featuring advanced security systems, energy barriers, pre-war surveillance technology, and extensive armories that allowed the Enclave to project force across the region, maintain command over subordinate units, and coordinate the seizure of Project Purity, positioning it as a nucleus of authoritarian control whose destruction was essential to dismantling the Enclave's ability to dominate the capital wasteland. The lone wanderer's infiltration and subsequent escape from Raven Rock required meticulous planning, technological expertise, and combat proficiency, encompassing the navigation of complex corridors, the neutralization or evasion of Enclave personnel equipped with advanced power armor and energy weapons, and the precise manipulation of security systems and environmental hazards, illustrating the profound challenges faced by a single individual acting against a highly organized, militarized faction whose survival depended on control of both personnel and technology. Concurrently, the events at Raven Rock catalyzed the fragmentation of Enclave forces, as Colonel Autumn's loyalists, deprived of central coordination, became vulnerable to strategic counterattacks by the Brotherhood of Steel, allied wasteland settlements, and opportunistic raider bands, highlighting the dependence of authoritarian regimes on centralized control, technological advantage, and psychological dominance, all of which were disrupted by the lone wanderer's intervention, demonstrating the critical role of agency, intelligence, and moral courage in shaping post-apocalyptic power dynamics. The confrontation at Raven Rock also intersected directly with the broader struggle for Project Purity, as the Enclave's control over water purification infrastructure, pre-war weapon caches, and key transportation routes posed an existential threat to civilian populations, and the lone wanderer's actions ensured both the recovery of vital components and the survival of personnel who could continue the project's mission, underlining the interdependence of strategic, ethical, and humanitarian considerations in the reconstruction of the capital wasteland. The subsequent dismantling of Raven Rock's command capabilities precipitated the broader collapse of the Enclave's regional authority, forcing surviving operatives to retreat, fragment into isolated cells, or engage in increasingly desperate and localized attempts to maintain influence, which ultimately culminated in their inability to prevent the activation of Project Purity and the restoration of potable water to thousands of inhabitants, effectively ending the Enclave's monopoly on technological and political power in the region. The psychological, technological, and symbolic significance of the lone wanderer's escape cannot be overstated, as it represents both a literal liberation from authoritarian control and a moral statement affirming the primacy of individual agency, ethical stewardship of technology, and the defense of community well-being against oppressive forces, while simultaneously providing a model for the reorganization and empowerment of local settlements, the reinforcement of alliances with the Brotherhood of Steel and other protective factions, and the stabilization of previously contested regions, demonstrating how tactical ingenuity, moral clarity, and strategic foresight can shift the balance of power in a fractured post-apocalyptic environment. In the wake of Raven Rock's fall, the capital wasteland experienced a profound recalibration of factional influence, with the Enclave reduced to scattered remnants incapable of mounting coordinated offensives, the Brotherhood of Steel emerging as a more prominent stabilizing force, settlements gaining leverage over their local environments, and Project Purity moving inexorably toward completion under the guidance of the lone wanderer, whose actions underscored the enduring importance of knowledge, courage, and ethical decision-making in shaping the long-term trajectory of a region defined by the interplay of technology, environment, and human agency, thus marking the escape from Raven Rock not merely as a tactical victory, but as a foundational moment in the reconstruction and moral realignment of the capital wasteland. The culmination of the lone wanderer's journey in the capital wasteland is defined by the final confrontation for control of Project Purity, a struggle that intertwines advanced technology, factional warfare, moral imperatives, and the fate of thousands of lives dependent on the successful activation of the massive water purification system, as the Brotherhood of Steel, the Enclave, and allied settlements converge on the Jefferson Memorial in a complex tableau of strategic positioning, firepower deployment, and ethical choice-making that will determine the region's future. The battle itself is characterized by a combination of tactical maneuvers, resource management, and direct engagement, with the lone wanderer coordinating with the Brotherhood of Steel, whose disciplined soldiers provide armored support and advanced energy weapons, including the formidable Liberty Prime, a pre-war robotic behemoth reactivated to serve as both a symbolic and practical counterweight to the Enclave's superior military technology, while simultaneously neutralizing heavily fortified Enclave positions, energy turrets, and armored infantry, all of which are designed to maintain control of the purifier and ensure the monopolization of the Potomac River's water supply. Colonel Autumn, representing the Enclave's strategic leadership on the ground, orchestrates a coordinated defense designed to delay, intimidate, and eliminate the lone wanderer and allied forces, deploying elite units, armored vehicles, and advanced weaponry to protect the Purifier infrastructure and maintain operational control, creating an environment where every tactical decision, from positioning to timing to resource allocation, carries the potential for catastrophic consequences, including the destruction of vital Project Purity components or the loss of civilian and allied lives. The Lone Wanderer's role is pivotal, combining pre-war technical knowledge inherited from James, real-time decision-making regarding combat priorities, and ethical judgments regarding the deployment of force, protection of innocence, and use of the Purifier itself, as activating the system prematurely or allowing it to fall into Enclave hands could dramatically alter the balance of power in the capital wasteland, demonstrating that technological mastery is inseparable from moral responsibility in a landscape where the stakes are both immediate and existential. Liberty Prime's deployment represents not only a tactical advantage but also a morale catalyst for Allied forces, symbolizing the resurgence of disciplined, morally directed human agency in opposition to authoritarian Enclave control. And its participation reshapes the battlefield by providing overwhelming firepower, psychological deterrence, and the ability to breach the most fortified Enclave positions, effectively tipping the balance in favor of the Lone Wanderer, while underscoring the interplay between pre-war technological relics and post-war strategic initiative. The battle unfolds as a layered conflict involving multiple zones of engagement, with ground-level skirmishes between infantry units, mid-range exchanges involving heavy weaponry, and long-range maneuvers to secure critical areas of the Purifier infrastructure, each layer demanding coordination, foresight, and adaptability, while simultaneously integrating narrative and moral elements such as the protection of civilians in Rivet City and nearby settlements, the prevention of environmental contamination, and the management of human and technological assets under duress, illustrating the multidimensional complexity of warfare in the post-apocalyptic capital wasteland. The climax of the engagement sees the Lone Wanderer directly interfacing with Project Purity, navigating control systems, initiating filtration sequences, and ensuring that the operational integrity of the system is maintained despite the chaos of battle, while Liberty Prime continues to neutralize Enclave forces and prevent counterattacks, and the culmination of these efforts results in the successful activation of the Purifier, delivering clean water to the Potomac River and providing the essential lifeline necessary to stabilize surrounding settlements, improve public health, and reassert civilian autonomy in a region long dominated by violence, scarcity, and authoritarian ambition. The final battle thus serves as both a literal and symbolic victory, representing the triumph of coordinated human initiative, ethical leadership, and technological stewardship over entrenched tyranny, while simultaneously highlighting the sacrifices, strategic ingenuity, and moral clarity required to navigate the intersection of science, power, and societal restoration, leaving the capital wasteland transformed by the availability of clean water, the diminution of the Enclave threat, and the assertion of a precedent for collaborative governance and ethical technological use that will inform the region's socio-political trajectory for decades, while establishing the Lone Wanderer as the central agent in shaping the fate of Washington, D.C., its inhabitants, and the fragile post-war civilization emerging from the shadow of nuclear devastation. Following the activation of Project Purity, the capital wasteland enters a period of renewed conflict as remaining Enclave forces, unwilling to accept the loss of their dominion and the failure of their plans for centralized control, initiate a series of aggressive maneuvers that extend beyond the Jefferson Memorial, sparking the events chronicled in Broken Steel, which effectively transform the post-Purifier landscape into a protracted war zone, wherein the Lone Wanderer, the Brotherhood of Steel, and allied settlements must coordinate strategic offensives, defend critical infrastructure, and contend with desperate, technologically capable enemies whose objectives range from regaining control over the Purifier to asserting a residual claim over the wasteland's remaining resources. The narrative of this war involves high-stakes military campaigns, including Liberty Prime's systematic liberation of key territories, such as Adams Air Force Base, where the Enclave maintained fortified positions and stockpiles of advanced pre-war weaponry, and the subsequent neutralization of heavily armored infantry, vertibird patrols, and tactical command centers that had been established to project Enclave authority over the region, highlighting the convergence of advanced technology, guerrilla tactics, and strategic coordination required to dismantle a highly organized, well-armed faction in a fragmented post-apocalyptic theater of operations. This ongoing conflict also emphasizes the logistical, ethical, and environmental complexities of prolonged warfare in a region already devastated by centuries of nuclear fallout, mutated wildlife, and human scarcity, as settlements such as Rivet City, Megaton, and Little Lamplight serve simultaneously as staging grounds, humanitarian hubs, and potential targets, compelling the Lone Wanderer and their allies to balance offensive operations with the protection of civilians, the preservation of ecological stability, and the restoration of potable water distribution systems enabled by Project Purity, demonstrating that the war is not merely a contest of firepower, but a multi-dimensional struggle integrating human survival, technological stewardship, and socio-political reconstruction. As the Lone Wanderer advances across the wasteland, the dismantling of enclaves is complemented by tactical interventions designed to isolate and incapacitate Colonel Autumn's forces, disrupt supply lines, seize critical hardware, and neutralize strategic positions that could prolong Enclave influence. While Liberty Prime functions as both a symbol of human ingenuity and moral resolve, and as an operational force multiplier, systematically eradicating remaining Enclave strongholds, suppressing enemy morale, and reinforcing the capacity of allied human settlements to assert autonomy and defend their reconstructed communities. The war also introduces complex moral decisions, such as the choice to spare or destroy captured technology, the management of potentially compromised settlements, and the negotiation of factional loyalties, illustrating that the struggle extends beyond conventional military objectives to include governance, the equitable distribution of resources, and the restoration of societal norms in a post-apocalyptic landscape where law, order, and survival must be carefully balanced against the temptation of unilateral authority or retribution. Through these engagements, the Lone Wanderer solidifies their role as both strategic commander and ethical arbiter, directly shaping the outcomes of conflicts, determining the operational readiness of allied forces, and ensuring that the purified water from Project Purity reaches the civilian population, thereby linking military success to humanitarian and ecological restoration, which collectively redefine the parameters of post-war governance, resilience, and technological stewardship in the capital wasteland. Ultimately, Broken Steel and the war it chronicles underscore the persistence of Enclave ideology even in the face of overwhelming defeat, the capacity of disciplined, morally guided forces to reclaim and protect vital resources, and the enduring impact of individual and collective agency in determining the survival, cohesion, and ethical trajectory of post-apocalyptic society, leaving the capital wasteland fundamentally transformed in terms of factional alignment, technological control, and societal stability, and cementing the lone wanderer's legacy as a central figure whose actions ensure that the mistakes, ambitions, and hubris of the pre-war United States are confronted and counterbalanced by both courage and prudence in the new era of Reconstruction. The activation of Project Purity and the subsequent defeat of the Enclave catalyzed profound shifts in the political, social, and environmental landscape of the capital wasteland, reshaping the power, influence, and long-term trajectories of major factions, while also redefining the parameters of survival and governance for independent settlements and mutated populations. The Brotherhood of Steel, under Elder Owen Lyons, emerged as the principal militarized stabilizing force, leveraging its technological superiority, organizational discipline, and moral commitment to protect and rebuild communities while maintaining control over recovered pre-war equipment and facilities, though the division with the outcasts persisted, reflecting enduring ideological disagreements over the use of advanced technology, the enforcement of pre-war knowledge preservation, and the balance between aggressive intervention and local autonomy, and the Lions chapter's expanded influence allowed them to act as both protectors and regulators in the reconstruction of regional society, mediating disputes, assisting in infrastructure repair, and preventing the resurgence of hostile factions. Independent settlements, from Rivet City to Megaton and Little Lamplight, capitalized on the availability of purified water to stabilize populations, expand agriculture, and develop local governance structures, transforming from vulnerable enclaves into resilient communities capable of self-sufficiency, trade, and mutual defense, with some, like Rivet City, assuming de facto regional leadership due to their access to technology, information, and humanitarian services, while others maintained smaller, insular structures, emphasizing localism and social cohesion in the absence of centralized authority. The outcasts, meanwhile, continued to operate independently of the Lions chapter, maintaining their strict preservationist philosophy and cautious engagement with the wider wasteland, functioning as both guardians of knowledge and as a critical check on the Brotherhood's expanding influence, illustrating that factional pluralism remained essential for the balance of power and the ethical oversight of post-war technological resources. Mutant populations, including supermutants and irradiated ghouls, continued to pose ecological and societal challenges, with the presence of irradiated territories and remnants of FEV experiments sustaining localized threats while also presenting opportunities for coexistence, negotiation, or containment, depending on the strategies of local leaders and the lone wanderer's interventions, and their treatment became emblematic of broader moral questions regarding inclusion, discrimination, and the ethical responsibilities of survivors toward non-traditional human populations. The Enclave, though militarily defeated, persisted in scattered, weakened cells, some retreating to isolated bunkers or attempting opportunistic raids, but their capacity for organized control was irreversibly diminished, effectively removing them as a central threat, while leaving a cautionary precedent regarding authoritarian overreach, the perils of technological monopolization, and the need for vigilance against emergent tyrannies in a post-apocalyptic environment. The combined effect of these shifts created a wasteland characterized by greater stability, the potential for cooperative governance, and enhanced humanitarian outcomes, particularly in terms of access to clean water, food security, and protection from radiation-related hazards. Yet the balance remained fragile, contingent upon ongoing leadership, technological stewardship, and ethical management of both human and environmental resources, illustrating that while the activation of Project Purity addressed immediate survival needs, the long-term sustainability of the capital wasteland required continual negotiation among factions, the maintenance of alliances, and vigilance against opportunistic or authoritarian actors. Ultimately, the fate of major factions after the Purifier reflects the broader theme of post-war reconstruction in Fallout 3, demonstrating how the interplay of power, technology, morality, and survival shapes the development of communities, the ethical use of pre-war knowledge, and the strategic landscape of a region emerging from centuries of devastation, and it establishes a foundation upon which the Lone Wanderer's legacy, the trajectory of settlements, and the evolving role of the Brotherhood, outcasts, and mutant populations will continue to influence the socio-political and environmental equilibrium of the capital wasteland for decades to come. The long-term legacy of the Lone Wanderer extends far beyond the immediate triumphs of Project Purity and the defeat of the Enclave, encompassing profound social, political, environmental, and cultural transformations in the capital wasteland that would reverberate across generations and serve as a touchstone for the reconstruction of post-apocalyptic America, as the protagonist's actions established critical precedents in the ethical management of technology, the distribution of essential resources, and the integration of diverse communities into a cooperative network capable of sustaining life amidst the enduring hazards of radiation, mutation, and fractured governance. Through the activation of Project Purity, the Lone Wanderer directly ensured the availability of potable water to thousands of inhabitants, enabling settlements such as Rivet City, Megaton, Little Lamplight, and numerous smaller enclaves to stabilize, expand, and develop robust governance structures, trade networks, and humanitarian services, demonstrating that the survival of civilization in the capital wasteland depended not only on immediate combat and technological mastery, but also on the ethical allocation of life-sustaining resources and the fostering of cooperative alliances across factional boundaries. Their interventions with the Brotherhood of Steel, the Outcasts, and independent communities facilitated the emergence of a pluralistic social order, wherein technological knowledge, strategic military capacity, and ethical leadership could coexist, allowing factions to maintain autonomy while contributing to collective security, disaster mitigation, and environmental stewardship, thereby mitigating the risk of authoritarian monopolization exemplified by the Enclave, and ensuring that pre-war knowledge could be harnessed responsibly for the benefit of the wider population rather than the enrichment or domination of a select few. The Lone Wanderer's direct confrontations with both human and mutant threats, including supermutants, raider clans, and the remnants of the Enclave, established a template for adaptive, morally guided decision-making under conditions of extreme scarcity and environmental hazard, reinforcing the principle that leadership in the wasteland is inseparable from ethical judgment, strategic foresight, and the protection of both vulnerable populations and critical infrastructure. a principle that would guide future generations of survivors and faction leaders in navigating the complex interplay between survival, technology, and morality. Culturally, the Lone Wanderer's deeds became the basis for mythologized narratives that circulated among wasteland communities, influencing storytelling, social norms, and local governance philosophies. As tales of their courage, decisiveness, and moral integrity inspired both oral histories and practical examples of civic responsibility, altruism, and the ethical use of pre-war technology, establishing a shared, symbolic framework that reinforced community cohesion, trust, and interfaction cooperation, while simultaneously warning against the dangers of authoritarianism, technological hubris, and unregulated exploitation of environmental resources. Environmentally, the consequences of the Lone Wanderer's actions are observable in the gradual restoration of contaminated regions, the stabilization of water systems, and the partial revitalization of flora and fauna dependent on the successful operation of Project Purity, illustrating the interconnection between human agency, ecological management, and long-term survival in a region still marked by the scars of nuclear devastation and centuries of neglect, and demonstrating that responsible intervention can have cascading positive effects on both human and non-human systems. In terms of political and factional influence, the Lone Wanderer's legacy solidified the role of the Brotherhood of Steel as a stabilizing force while preserving the independence of the outcasts, empowering settlements to self-govern, and neutralizing the Enclave as a coherent threat, thereby reshaping the power dynamics of the wasteland in ways that allowed for sustained peace, development, and ethical governance, and establishing a precedent for collaborative security and technological oversight that would influence regional decision-making for decades. Finally, the Lone Wanderer's enduring legacy is reflected in subsequent references across the Fallout franchise, serving as a benchmark for heroism, moral complexity, and the interplay between technology, leadership, and survival in post-apocalyptic contexts. And their story illustrates how individual agency, when guided by ethical principle, strategic acumen, and a commitment to collective well-being, can profoundly transform the trajectory of civilization in the aftermath of catastrophic collapse, ensuring that the capital wasteland's recovery, social cohesion, and environmental stewardship are inseparable from the example set by one individual whose choices became the foundation for the reconstruction and long-term resilience of post-war America.